Greetings, everybody, and welcome to a lecture that I feel is a long time in the making, in the sense that I've been teaching this material for some time now, and I think it is a fan favorite, and that includes students. I think I've always had students who have really enjoyed the novel Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, and then when we get involved with the analysis in class and we start to see what some of these characters symbolize on a broader level, and kind of the missions that are put before them, and what they're chasing. There's a lot of interesting things to talk about, not just with the main character, but really many of the characters that are a part of this journey, right, for Rick Deckard. So I've prepared lecture notes for the first half of the story, first half being chapters 1 through 10. And pretty much everything is chronological here, so I'll just be kind of going through. But I think that's helpful when we deal with a bigger novel like this, because everything kind of builds off of what came before it. So it's the best way to try to understand the story at large, is taking it piece by piece, right? And so let's get right into it. I don't want to waste too much time with introductions here. Our first introduction to the book itself is it kind of comes through Iran, Rick's wife, and she tends to be jaded and doesn't really want reality to settle in. She's willing to keep some kind of distraction going instead of dealing with the world as is. And the world as is, as we start to get the exposition and the backstory, is of course a pretty depressing one, right? Of course we're dealing with a dystopia where, to put it frankly, the world has essentially destroyed itself, much like we fear nowadays of nuclear annihilation. Philip K. Dick, the author here, kind of makes it come true, and that's just part of the background of the story that we get here, right? In order to achieve that feeling and to get distracted from just being, not necessarily being miserable from the reality that they have to deal with, but at least whatever emotions might come from it, she uses something called the Penfield mood organ. And of course, this is where I think we recognize right away that we are dealing with a science fiction novel, because this is something pretty fantastic, where you can start to alter your mood to feel any kind of way that you can feel. And the way that this is described with dials, it seems like there could be possibly hundreds of feelings. And I guess that speaks to the complexity of who human beings are and what we're capable of, is having really hundreds upon hundreds of different kind of emotional dispositions at any given time. But in the future, what this is, of course, a reflection of, we've now been able to kind of make that happen through a machine and something through technology. Now, Philip K. Dick, I'll say it quickly, is known to have written predictive science fiction, which means some of the stuff he writes about, in whether it be in the 60s, 70s, are actually kind of coming true, right, years, decades later. So you see that we can be on the lookout for that in this particular text. Keep in mind, he's written dozens upon dozens of novels, right? And many short stories as well. Who does Iran wake up to? Rick, right? And one thing we find out right away is she resents him for being, essentially, she calls him a killer. He's a murderer, right? And it's his job to murder androids. Of course, there's one of the big debates, right? Is it really murder, or, as they say, is it retiring because it's not real? That's, of course, one of the big debates we'll get into, one of the big topics, right? But she is very discontent with Rick. The androids, we also find out, and this is provided more exposition, are used primarily as slaves on the off-world, on Mars, to incentivize going there in the first place, right? So that's what I find so interesting about this text and other books he writes as well. We've reverted to some of the older systems that showcase how disparaging the human race can be, right? How we can subjugate others and oppress others, and we have all this kind of pain and misery to show for it. And I think that's part of it, right? it can happen all over again. You thought that we would learn our lessons of slavery is bad through history, but now we're doing it again just with androids this time around, right? Okay, for Rick himself, his first, I guess you could say, issue that we find out about, he'll have much bigger ones as the story goes on, is he wants a real sheep as opposed to the fake one that he has on his rooftop. And we find out that to a lot of people, including his neighbor, he kind of comes clean here in this first chapter of this book. He's been trying to pass it off as a real one, but of course it's fake. It's electric. And we find out about the demise of Gaucho later on in this chapter, right? Right away, though, you see that there is a huge difference between real and fake, and it's speaking on two different levels here: fake and real animals. Here, of course, real animals being preferred, and fake and real people. Right? In the case of fake being androids, and what's our preference here? Right? We can ask that question as we move forward. Something you might it just kind of slips by if you're not really reading into it, is the Mountebank lead cod pieces. And this is just referencing, this is essentially an allusion to a product that you have to wear as a man in this world, especially if you want to have children, and right, kind of keep the depleted race going, which is so important. And I think that's one of the most important themes of the entire text, is to keep life going, life, hope, whatever it might be, right? In a world that it's barely hanging on here. And so what a Mountebank lead cod piece is going to do is two things for us. One, it speaks to the levels of radiation, that you would have to protect your testicles, right, from radiation so that you could still produce normal offspring, all right? And another thing it does for us, and I think this might be on a more subtle level, is it speaks to this whole idea of codpiece. And what is codpiece? Think Romeo and Juliet, one of the original versions, the 1970s version, where it speaks to the time period way back when they would wear very tight pants and put a codpiece down there to accentuate the male genitalia, to portray a certain type of character or a certain type of attitude, right? It all speaks to the culture. I think it also speaks to this idea of kind of masculinity, maybe even an outright masculinity in terms of what we try to show in public. Our standards can be much different nowadays. I think they do tend to be on a general level. But just to accentuate that whole idea of masculinity, right? And this need to show some kind of aggression or assertion through a codpiece. Those emphasis on those male traits such as size and strength, and also virility, which is the ability to kind of procreate, right, and keep life going. It seems there's not a big sexual relationship between Iran and Rick in this text early on, and I think that does turn out to be somewhat important when we see the types of relationships that may develop later on. The overall emptiness that we feel here, the way the world is described, people kind of, now kind of reserved to certain areas within the city that are still able to kind of harbor the little life that remains, people being encouraged to just leave and go to Mars, Mars being a theme all in itself, just to speak to it, because I like to just get everything out on the table with these lectures. Mars is usually God of war. So again, aggression, assertion, dominance, war, right? The whole kind of general landscape of war, that is reflected in Mars. And here we are as a people in the context of the text being encouraged to go there. And let this be our new possibility. Thematically, maybe that's not a great possibility for us. It's one that's already kind of flawed due to this idea of aggression and war. So due to all this barrenness, it does make me feel on a personal level, and again, I think this is supported later on, almost like a barren womb of a mother. A place where life cannot kind of come to be, right? Cannot grow. And that's what it kind of feels like, Earth in general at this point in time. This leads to Iran mentioning something from the field of psychology called absence of effect or flattened effect. And she wants to actually tune into this. It's kind of, she found a setting for despair. And that just, I think what flattened effect means is that stimuli that really should get you moving, like seeing maybe somebody in distress or hearing a certain thing. In fact, really what the Voigt-Kampff empathy test will essentially kind of measure for, right? She has no reaction to these things anymore. So things that normally would cause some kind of outrage or some kind of reaction from us, when you have this idea of absence of effect, or I think worse than that is flattened, meaning very, there is none. That means there's just no reaction any longer to things that there should be a reaction to, right? And it speaks to the attitudes of humanity, I think, living in this world, this dystopia. Rick seems fairly optimistic when we to appreciate the awareness of the manifold possibilities open to him. It seems what he would like to kind of dial into, and the artificial emotion and kind of sense that he would like to feel, I think sounds much more optimistic than what Iran is ready to do, which is this kind of absence of effect. Iran, it says here, I'll use some specific language, Iran is given up as a great weight of an almost absolute inertia settled over her. So that idea of something being on you, I think this speaks to levels of depression. It'll speak to something else more specific in the text dealing with androids, but I don't want to get into specifics too much here. But it's this idea that when you get a weight upon you, a psychological weight that just feels so heavy that you essentially surrender to it, right? And that's how Iran is said to feel here early on, right? As if this world is to crumble, it's as if she's already kind of given into that, perhaps, and it's led her to have no movement whatsoever. She's just kind of stuck in the inertia of everything coming down. One thing I like to make us think about here, or have us think about, I should say, is with the Penfield mood organ, we don't have anything quite like this. We got alcohol, we got drugs, we got marijuana, we got TV, we got sports, we got all kinds of stuff that obviously has a psychological impact on how we feel, the states that we find ourselves in, the reflections that we find ourselves in, right? So there's all kinds of things as a society that we use to curb our emotions, right? And to try to have a more of an artificial way of handling our emotions than just dealing with them, right? Taken to the extreme in this book with the situation of a Penfield mood organ, you simply dial in. And I do think, especially when we get into other things that have this kind of tangible sense to them in this book, the empathy boxes with Mercerism. My thoughts going through this book quite a bit is that Philip K. Dick is pretty vague in how things actually work. Like we get some sense of, you're going to hold on here, and in this sense something plugs in, or you're dialing in. But the details, I think, are left vague on intentionally, because it's kind of it's so kind of science fiction to be able to do this. However, we do watch sports. We do drink a beer at the end of the day, or have a glass of wine, whenever that might be. So we are doing other things. We watch a lot of TV. Who knows what we do, right? We exercise. Just trying to get us to think about the things we do to alter the emotional states that we find ourselves in by nature due to actual circumstances around us, right? So here we go. We get into some of the dystopian elements of the text. One is World War Terminus. And Terminus is the war to end all wars, meaning there was so much nuclear devastation from this, and then the fallout, which of course is even worse. I'm sure many of you have played Fallout by Bethesda games. It's a pretty popular series. But you can see, this whole idea of the aftermath being even worse as the world is just left to decay, right, and ruin. I think when you think of World War Terminus, because a lot will be said about the human character, right, and what's in us, kindness versus malice, and how we treat each other. There's so many references that'll get us thinking about that overall theme, right, how we treat each other. That I think World War Terminus, obviously a war that's devastated the entire globe, really probably reflects hatred and malice on a level that was irreparable, right? And now we're dealing with what we have. We hope as a human species, I say this with all reality in mind, that never comes to pass. It's a beautiful day. I'm staring at the mountains right now. But you never know, right? I think authors take it there in science fiction to get you to think about your own current situation. And yeah, nuclear annihilation is definitely something that a lot of experts would say is still something we should be worried about, right? Well, here it's happened, and maybe it reflects that we've just taken it too far. Our connections with each other, a big term you'll hear is empathy. Go online, empathy. That's probably all you hear when you look it up online with this book. But it is an important topic, and what's happened to empathy if here we have World War Terminus, right? So it really speaks pretty negatively to that. And now we got this culture of real versus fake. Even Rick uses a vet that comes and repairs fake animals, electric animals, but they try to pass themselves off as real vets working on real animals. So it's almost like this feeling of embarrassment and shame, you know, when you don't have a real animal, something you want to keep secret. However, you got to act like you have a real animal. It's better to have an electric one than not have one at all. And you'll learn more about this. It speaks to this idea of empathy and connections we still have to the planet, right? In this world that is utterly dying. You can think for yourself why there might be such a fixation on the real animals. For me, you know, I think for me, I've always, one idea that comes to mind is, yes, that connection to the real Earth that is kind of slipping away. We learned that real animals and androids, right, or I'm sorry, electric animals and androids are far superior in terms of build, in terms of intellect, in terms of physical ability, far superior. But at the end of the day, they're not human, right? And there's a major difference. Okay. This can... Okay, so I think one thing this book does in a big way, and so many authors do this, I feel, is imbue the names, the main characters' names and minor characters with meaning, which gets us to think on a level of theme, Let's see if I can get my cat on camera here. While I talk about do androids dream of electric sheep, it would be perfection. Right, here comes a real animal who's warm and wants my warmth, right? And we also got a puppy inside not too long ago, cutie pie named Bruno. This is Bandita. I don't know if she's gonna come on camera, but it's, you know, we were just talking about this a second ago, right? Imagine a world where almost every animal is pretty much extinct, and now you have like a Kelly Blue Book for the ones that are left, and that's what the Sydney's is in this text, right? Basically like a Kelly's Blue Book of real animals, right? It speaks to their rarity, their prices, right? Everyone wants to get one. All right, so let's get these names out real quick. Rick means powerful and strong ruler, right? I think it's a pretty ironic name to give to a guy who can't even keep his wife happy in the beginning of the text, right? So he doesn't feel like the most powerful person, but there'll probably be some validity to that as we learn more about him, his job, the role he plays. Powerful, strong ruler, right, for Rick. That's our main character. Let's talk about his last name, and this is so perfectly chosen. Deckard. And I think it's German, if I'm not mistaken, for roofer, somebody who puts a roof on something. And I think it's German, so that's important to remember too. You're going to see a lot of references to German so as to reference the Holocaust and the parties involved there, German, right? We were just talking about that overall theme of human beings and how we treat each other. One of the big examples history has always talked about there is going to be the Holocaust, right? And the treatment of Jewish populations, not to mention others. Homosexual, gypsy, political dissenters, and I know I'm missing another one in there as well, right? But there was other people as well. So, okay, to put a roof on. The next thing I want to get kind of present to you early on is the theme, the kind of paradoxical theme, I guess you could say, of ascent versus descent. Start to look for that word, or how many times you see, oh, he's ascending to the roof. Notice to go see the animals early on in this text, you got to ascend to the roof, right? Versus descent. what's happening in the story, that's right before, he ascends to get to that event. Or now he descends, and what happens there, right? That's going to be a big kind of theme for us. And notice that if we are speaking to this idea of ascent, to go up, right, or even to fly upward, Rick Deckard's name, last name Deckard being roofer, is not a great name for ascending. Because if I'm trying to ascend, what's a roofer going to do? They're going to put a roof right there. There's no more ascent. So we'll be able to kind of read into ascent, descent more so. But see how many, I used to circle it when I first started reading this book, how many times we're going up and we're going down, right? So pay attention to that. So this is all transitioning into our kind of first introduction to Mercerism, which is the religion of this book, right? And we're even given kind of similar characters here, right? And remember that if we had to lay it out and say what separates human beings from robots and artificial intelligence, and one book I use for the 1C class is Rise of the Robots. It's nonfiction. It's all about real robots, more importantly, AI, algorithms that are putting all kinds of work out of people out of work, including middle management, right? And making it so there's just a few top jobs for a lot of these companies on top. And then the whole goal being to create algorithms and systems that put everybody else out of jobs. You don't even need them, and it's cost saving, right? So back to this. So yes, I mean, there's so many, it's a relevant issue is what I mean to say, but if it's ever going to come to it, think about what's that one thing that's going to keep us as humans human. And some people might say religion, right? Can AI get into religion? Can AI truthfully have a connection to religion and believe and have faith and all these things that go into it, right? And that's going to be one of the frustrations for the androids in this book, is their inability to kind of connect with this Mercer guy. Whereas human beings, whether you are just, fine, right, no radiation problems, or if you're a special, as we'll meet, really one of the second, I would say almost as big as Rick is John Isidore. And we meet him in the second chapter, right? And he's a special, meaning he's been affected by radiation, he's got some issues, but even he, both of them, as long as you're human, you can kind of connect to this whole idea of Mercerism. So is that what separates us from any potential AI in the future, is we can believe in religion, whereas there's no real way that a machine can do that, right? An artificial intelligence. Animals are very much like within the, let's say, principles and the important ideas and messages of Mercerism, to have a real animal as one of them. The backstory of Mercer. Just like there are backstories to the Buddha, there are backstories to Christ, there are backstories to Muhammad. These are highly enriched characters because of all the lessons that are taught through them, and these kind of biblical scriptures that have existed for very long periods of time. We find out that he was compassionate to animals, lives with them, brings them back from the dead, has this symbiotic relationship with essentially animals in nature. Again, in a world that's been utterly destroyed by war, technology, nuclear weaponry, etc. So it's kind of like a nature figure as well. And one of the reasons there's such a strong need to have an animal as well. Oh, a couple of other names here that I didn't cover yet. Bill Barber, right? This is his neighbor who he has a discussion with, and he has a real horse. Horse is pregnant. I think he's going to have another horse. And Rick's like, can I have your real horse and I'll give you my fake sheep? And he's like, no. And he's like, by the end of it, don't feel too bad about having a fake sheep, right? It's better than not having anything. But let's just talk about what his name means. Bill, and he's a very minor character. I think this is really the only time we deal with Bill in the whole story. But Bill means resolute protector. Resolute meaning like strong and gonna be able to stand my ground. Resolute, right? I'll be a resolution to this. And the word protector is so important. You'll see that name repeated in other allusions and other names that we have throughout the text here too. So protector. what are you protecting? I guess that's the question. Next up is barber, and look no further than what it sounds like. Rick is to cut short in terms of roofing. What does a barber do? It sounds kind of silly. He cuts off the your hair from ascending. He cuts off the hair from growing to any full potential that your hair would ever have. When you go to the barber, you might think you're doing yourself a favor. It might feel great. But all that potential that is getting cut away there, a barber does the same thing. It limits, right? It cuts off at a certain point. For the sake of totality in these lectures, I'll get right into it because I don't think other people are necessarily making these connections, and I want to make them clear. Cutting the life short of an android. Artificial life, artificial lifespans. And we are cutting it short. We're saying it ends here. Instead of letting it live forever and flourish, just like, well, humans do have a lifespan too, but not as short as what are being kind of forced upon the androids, right? 4, 5 years, 6 years, whatever it might be. Short lifespans. And you get that right here in the beginning. Rick Deckard, roofer, Bill Barber. We are limiting the potential of your hair, the growth there, right? If you read carefully enough toward the end of the first chapter, there's an irony. As he's confessing to Bill that his sheep is fake, the sheep is described as rather real, almost as if it doesn't matter to defy that fact. It still comes across as very real. I think that speaks to the technology itself, but to get you thinking about bigger themes, maybe it speaks to this idea of acceptance and what we accept is real, right? Which could speak to epics of human history where people had to be recognized as real human beings, especially slaves. And you think about the slave populations of the ancient world, they were gigantic. Rome was, what, half slaves, people existing in this state. And of course, there was a bit fluid, but for the most part, it was a pretty casted system, I would imagine. And just two classes of people, right, within the world. Bill suggests that he get a cat. My cat was just around here, and believe it or not, my cat's probably hunting things right now in this little backyard that we have. And I think that's the intended meaning. The protector says, get yourself a cat, something that is the hunter, predator. Rick wants a herd animal, right? He wants either a horse or, something along those lines, prey. Right, but more of a herd animal, one that has to live and commingle with others in order for its survival and existence. One of the big topics we'll get is the solitary predator, right? The cat is in some ways, though they are very social, in this case, the solitary predator, whereas Rick's thinking something that is a way more connected to other animals in the herd. Dave Holden, this is the bounty hunter that really got lucky he didn't lose his life, is the idea. And David translates to beloved or uncle. So in a way, he is kind of beloved because he survived being killed by androids. He's got information. He is kind of, we want to protect him in that way. And look at the last name, Holden. Old English, it translates to healed, H-E-A-L-D, which means guard. Notice you're getting that topic, that theme of guarding something, protecting something, very early on here. And these are characters that are all close to Rick. So I think in a way he's sharing in these characteristics early on. The protector, the guard, right? Powerful. We notice there's a lot of guarding, protecting so far in this novel. And we just got done with chapter 1, we're on to chapter 2. We're in San Francisco. If you watch Blade Runner, it's LA. They changed it for the film. After reading this book and you see how deep these themes go and how interesting it is, the movie's good, but it's nothing like this. The Rand Corporation that's referenced in chapter 2 is a real corporation. Dick does this a lot in his literature. Uses real enterprises, real organizations, real military-industrial complex. This is like a think tank, I think, the Rand group. It might be more or less a think tank for the military-industrial complex and some other kind of, I guess you could say, industries. It's a big one. Feel free to wiki it. And so they're mentioned here early on. What has happened to androids? How are they being utilized? Slave labor on Mars. All kinds of slave kind of capacities. Pleasure slaves, workers, right? So everything, kind of, meeting all this, all of the roles that they need to. They are incredibly smart, they're incredibly attractive, they're capable. Human beings are stopping at nothing to advance the realness of them. really the superiority of them over normal human kind of capabilities. Pushing the limit. We find ourselves dealing with Nexus 6s. So notice this is just models and a whole line of perfecting the android. I'd love to know what your guesses are, how long you think we have in real years to get to something like that. Probably 100 years, 200 years, 250 years, who knows, right? Where it is walking, talking almost like it is completely real. You can't tell the difference. That's what this company is trying to make happen, is that you can't even tell the difference. The only issue here, we mentioned this, Rick Deckard, the roofer, Bill Barber, the hair, getting your hair cut, built-in lifespans, cutting short or limiting, like a roof, lifespan, right? And this is the one that triggers these androids. They want to live longer. For humans, they are left on a sunless Earth trying to procreate despite a tainted, defective human race, right? Enter, really almost the second main character. I don't mind saying that, John Isidore. Let's get the names out of the way. John, God is gracious. We're very much, I think, leashed to some kind of religious symbolism when it comes to John, right? God is gracious. Even the name itself, the Hebrew. Now, Isidore is different, though. Isidore is interesting. Gift from Isis. Isis taking us back to Egyptian times, Egyptian culture. And Isis was known to be so generous and so forgiving. Now we think about that. As we start off this book, get going, how much will John reflect that idea of giving and generosity as he starts to come into contact with some of these androids in the story? In any case, I think he has a very positive symbolism with his name. So we'll see if it suggests some accurate meaning for us as we move forward. So notice on the TV set, leave it to the TV to advertise some of the worst things that could ever be advertised. And what's being advertised here is slaves, androids, as a way to get people to emigrate to Mars. Come to Mars. Let's not highlight all the horrible things about being on Mars and how dangerous it is and, experimental, right? But guess what you get? You get your own slave, right? Or slaves, right? I think they're promised one, to be honest, but ain't that something, right? Okay, well, to sweeten the deal, you're going to have your own slave. I think it's absurd, and I think that's the whole effect, because we recognize that a society, despite World War Terminus, I think that's even easier to swallow than this idea of now turning around and using androids, which kind of look and feel like real human beings, as slave labor, but it speaks to what human beings are ready to do and what they are capable of doing. All right, so I think that's the whole point. We've done it again. You'd think you'd learn a lesson? Not so much. Think about Mars. Is it really a place we want to wind up in terms of symbolism, war, aggression, assertiveness, which actually connects to a lot of other stories in the way they handle Mars as well as a symbol. And going back to the Greek and kind of Roman way of characterizing Mars. Is that really where we want to be? Or do we seek to rejuvenate Earth just like a mother who renews with a new life, right, and populates and brings life back to the world? There is the founding of what they call a new America on Mars. Same dedication, same conceit, and the same need to stake a claim, right, which might not be the best characteristics, the same type of characteristics that maybe got us involved in a World War Terminus to begin with. Heated competition, never backing down, right, all that kind of stuff. Having to stake my claim, put up my flag, and then, grow from there, right? And slavery flourishes again on Mars, which makes sense, again, when you think about what Mars represents. War, conquest, all right? The big debate, students always fall on both sides of this when they get involved. Should it be considered real slavery if the androids aren't real? If they're not real human beings, is it truly slavery? Or do we just look at it completely different, right? And just be happy that we have the technology as is. All right, so we now have Hannibal Sloat. This is John's boss. And let's get the names out of the way. Hannibal is Grace of Baal, B-A-A-L, which I think is just a very old word within a certain region for God. All right, and it is the god of fertility and fortune, right, Baal. Fertility is huge. We have a desolate planet, barren, right, clinging on to very little. So that whole idea of fertility is huge thematically. Sloat, what a last name. It translates to drainage ditch or a channel going down, right? And that's that descent that I mentioned early on, right? Here we've talked about some examples of ascent, but here now we have a clear, even through the character's name, this idea of descent and going all the way down. And I think symbolically it's going to be death, a final reproach, right, to go all the way down to the very end. We get a little bit of Latin here from Sloat, believe it or not, and he says Mercerta vita incerta, which means death is certain, life is uncertain. And there you go, a drainage ditch. Everything spirals down, right? Thanks to gravity, of course, but it's all going down that drain. It's all going down. And that's a certainty, whereas it's the life that's uncertain. And maybe that gets us thinking on thematic and philosophical levels as well, right? Where is the life? If it's uncertain, where can we find it? Is it possible to get it back? There's a lot of silence, I guess, with any sense of death. The silence is ironically deafening. He can hear it. The world taking back what is its, right? Without human beings and kind of our civilization there to kind of be a part of the noise any longer. Something that I think Philip K. Dick, he coined this term, so it's not a real term. Kipple or Kippleization, not kibble, which is what we feed our dogs. Kipple, K-I-P-P-L-E. And it's kind of the Kippleization of the material world, meaning everything, including like this kind of magna stone here, whatever that is, my metal spoon here, this phone that has, these gadgets that have all kinds of things and components. The idea is that if left long enough to itself with nothing around, it would essentially just kind of amass into this like pile of nothing all around us, right? And that's what you're fighting against with a sense of life, I think, in the text, right? Is against that state of final Kippleization. It is a lifeless, fine debris that covers everything, right? Everything just kind of breaks down into some final state, some natural state, perhaps. The world takes back what is its. I think a good example of that visually, it's a decent video game, was the first Last of Us. When you go through the cities and you see like the giraffes, like the famous scene there, where just nature is really kind of taken back what is its. The problem here, though, is that we have all this radiation which has killed nature, right? But it's still kind of everything just becoming this lifeless state of debris. All right. So with that in mind, I like how the book is structured, because here we are given Hannibal Sloat. We're in the drainage kind of ditch, right? We're talking about death, completely a loss of entropy, which is kind of complete loss of energy, right? And then we start to talk about the hope here, right? And this is where we start talking about empathy with the empathy box and Mercer a lot more. John doesn't have a real animal. There is this idea that a special might not be able to take care of an animal because of its limited, because of its impaired abilities. So they don't really do animals, but they can still get on the empathy box infused with Mercer, which is essentially the religion of the text. Now, what is empathy? Essentially, a very basic way of putting it would be putting yourself in somebody else's shoes and let that affect your decision making, right? And what you really do. And feeling for other people. I guess one way of putting it is knowing when someone's in a state of need, right? Being able to really understand when a person's in a state of need. And that's one, I think when you go online and you type in like what this book is all about, you just see a one-word answer, which is empathy, because it is a big part of the text. It's all wound up early on with Mercer, right? Mercer means merchant, right? If you start to kind of follow the root there, it's merchant. So it's interesting we're talking about almost like capitalism and transactions. Notice this game does discuss consumerism on some level. In order to fuse with Mercer, you're going to have an animal. In order to have an animal, you're going to have money, right? So it speaks to this idea of putting a real price tag on something. Capitalism. His first name is Wilbur, which translates to wild boar, which translates to difficult to hunt, which is interesting when you're thinking about the theme of predator versus prey. This guy is the guy who's hard to hunt, right? Which allows, if you're hard to hunt, that means that your little group of animals there is going to thrive, right? So it does speak to this idea of potential growth as well. John is very alone, but together with the common experience, when using the empathy box, he feels very connected to a world that is kind of falling away. Now, this is where it gets weird. You almost got to just suspend your belief for this one. But when you use the empathy box and you go through the whole kind of experience with Mercer and rising to the top of this mountain and having the killers, that's what they're called, throw rocks at you and stones. When you come out of the experience, you actually do have those wounds. It's very similar to the religious idea of stigmata, which is actually having the wounds of Christ in your, most commonly in your wrists, right? And somebody having those wounds. There's some films that kind of showcase this. So I think that's the most common thing that we could talk about in our own experience, but it is weird, and it's not really described much. Like I said, he doesn't really do that much, how it really happens. But you do walk away with cuts and bruises, which is, a physical representation, a material, tangible representation of the real pain that Mercer has gone through, right? Similar idea of being stigmata with Christ, right? To have the wounds that reflect that. You feel the pain that Mercer experiences from the killers. No, not the rock band. Just this kind of antagonistic force that is wound up in the story with Mercer. And that's my big joke for the day, the rock band, which I actually liked the Killers at one point. They're a pretty good band. Mercer's beginnings are a bit similar to Moses, the idea of a child floating down a river to find refuge, right? He can revive dead animals. He's arrested as a freak, a special, right? They think he's a special. The toad is the most important to Mercer, maybe because the toad reflects the early, this kind of amphibious version of what a human, in terms of evolutionary kind of scope, what we came from, right? Coming out of the water for the first time and becoming something different. I'm not sure why the toad gets a special kind of place in Mercer's heart, but he does. It does. And he rises and ascends with the animal metabolic world, right? He's a part of kind of the living, breathing entity of the animal world, and he rises with it. Overall, the experience is satisfying for John. It seems to be a character, he seems to be a character imbibed with religious ideals and context, hence his need for Mercerism. Moving right into chapter 3. Right away we have the police inspector, Harry Bryant. More names just that represent strong kind of protectors. Harry is home ruler of home. Bryant, noble, strong, and virtuous, like warriors, right? And I think that makes sense in the way that we're dealing with bounty hunters and police officers, right? These might be terms that make sense for these types of roles, these types of professions. Here he has to go and talk to the Rosen Association. Rosen is rose, or roses specifically in German. Notice we're going to have some words that bring us back to the German experience. The Holocaust in Germany and the surrounding countries. That talk about what's happening in Germany when these people are waking up and seeing this happen around them, right? And how some people can be okay with it, and even the people that it's happening to, the Jews themselves. You get this feeling of, I can't escape this. There's nowhere I can go. And notice we have that feeling described in this text as well. So it's really to bring us back to, as one of the prime examples, the Holocaust in Germany. Roses, though, let's think about that on a thematic level. Life, flowers, beauty, right? Nature. I hope you got some on Valentine's Day, right? We find out about Nexus 6 androids. So 6 is a good number for Philip K. Dick in some of these books. He uses it in Flow My Tears, the Policeman Said, where there's this like model 6 as well, sixes, right? And it speaks to like an elevated class of people who have been bioengineered and stuff, right? They've had some enhancements. Here we get Nexus 6 androids, and I think 6 is definitely, it speaks to the days of creation. On the 6th day, it's man and woman, and according to the narrative, it's flawed. There's the Genesis, right, the Garden of Eden, and failing that whole test. And so now you have 666, which is Mark of the Beast, and part of that is Judas and the betrayal of Christ, right? And we'll get into that more. But 6, because when you do 6, you know, when you talk about, you know, the importance of the number 6, it really does speak to Judas and being associated with the Mark of the Beast in the sense that the way and the treatment of Christ in those important moments, right? So here we have the 6s. So that ties, I think, into biblical stuff right away. They are the best so far. They are hard to detect. They can pass for human, right? And they are a representation of our collective humanity in the sense that this is how far we've brought this android technology. You can almost kind of counter that with 6 as biblical, the biblical mark of the beast, as I said, and Judas as a good term here, I'm glad I'm reading it, self-preservationist, right? A self-preservationist. If you're a self-preservationist, what happened to that empathy that we've been already discussing so far, right? Nexus, what does the word nexus mean? A connection of two things. And I think the whole point of that, within the bounds of the text, is that's what this is. Humans coming together with robot android, or I should say robot AI, right? Artificial intelligence, algorithms, and creating this thing that you can't even tell the difference any longer. A perfect nexus between the two, right? Also drawing upon the best from both of those worlds. Everything human, and we'll talk about what makes human human, right? We've already talked about religion and the ability to connect there. But also the best of that robot AI world too, the smartest, right? We talk about, and the book that I talk about, Rise of the Robots, talks about, you know, the first time the machines started beating us in checkers and chess and all these important things that we used to think represent human achievement and human greatness. Well, guess what? They're doing that with their, dare I say, eyes closed, but they don't have eyes, right? Got to come up with a better one there. But these machines are destroying us on those levels. And so I think it speaks to that too. The best of both worlds, click together, here you go. Nexus 6s. All right. And thriving. Let me see here. Yeah, there is kind of an irony here, though, because when you think about human beings within the context of this story, they're dying, barely holding on, whereas androids are getting smarter and more highly developed every day. They're coming out with models like they do computers and phones for us, right? And here we get to the Voigt-Kampff empathy test, right? And we start to translate the German. And essentially what you get here is Voigt is bailiff, right? Which means like somebody who stands in a, you know, the bailiff in a courthouse, somebody who stands there and kind of protects and provides order, makes sure order is kind of in court. So playing that type of role. Kampf, you've probably heard this word from the German, right? It means struggle. So you put it together, what is the Voigt-Kampff empathy test? The bailiff of struggle. And essentially what it means, I'll kind of put it in my own terms, it is the kind of the guardian of whose struggle matters, right? It is the guard of whose struggle we say is real and whose struggle we say is fake, right? The guardian of who makes that kind of determination. There's all that protector stuff we've been talking about. It really kind of culminates in the test itself, which is all about being a guardian, right? Providing some kind of protection here. Protection for the human race, definitely, and we'll find out more. I'll just say what I have here on the page. The judge of who authentically struggles and whether or not it requires concern. You are not human, therefore your pain and suffering does not matter. Something the Nazis probably said in theory to the Jews, and something within the text human beings are probably saying within theory to the androids themselves, right? People they deem as not human, slaves, people who are lower than them. And that's why, you know, we start to talk about the Holocaust. Hence why there's so much German and Hebrew names and phrases. Rick Deckard, very German name, kind of right off the bat. I think Rick is a little bit more English, but Deckard is a very German name. And then it starts to contrast with a name like John, right, which gives us a name that comes from the Hebrew, right? So tying together those two different peoples within that context. All right. Androids cannot fuse with Mercer, so that whole experience that John had in chapter 2, that can't happen for androids. Spiders are linked to androids in the sense of being solitary, unempathic creatures. Always think, which characters does this seem to apply to, right? Who seems to be the solitary predator, always on his or her own in this text? Who seems to be the spider? You'll also see a spider later on in the text. No spoilers there. I just want to kind of mention that to tie you back to what's happening here in chapter 3. Empathy is a double-edged sword when you start to engage with the empathy box. On one hand, it connects you to the good of the world. However, on the other hand, it connects you to the pain and the suffering and the misery and the hurt in the world as well. So you got to take the good and the bad. That's what empathy is all about. Okay. We start to get some exposition, some background on the androids. Androids killed their masters on Mars. Essentially, they're treated like slaves. We find out they killed their masters to escape to Earth, right? And they're looking for cover. They're trying to stay hidden. And it's Rick's job to go out and retire them. Notice they don't say kill, because that might imply that they're human, right? But they do say retire. And it's his job to go out as a bounty hunter and basically capture them and kill them. I think he would like to bring them. Actually, I think his goal is, once he finds out for certain that they are androids through the means that he has, I think he does, as he told, to just eliminate them. They don't even worry about like trials and stuff like that with androids, which kind of tells about their overall feelings about them, right? Now, one thing I want to ask here is, we find out that androids killed their masters on Mars, mutinied, they say, and fled back, right, to find cover on Earth. My question is, do you blame them? If this were real life, do we blame slaves for killing their masters? I don't know. That's a much more difficult question, with a lot of different moral and ethical ways to consider it. So it's not as easy. Do we afford androids? Even in theory, if they were really to exist someday in this kind of fashion, right? What is it? Another video game that came out, Detroit, right? Something Detroit, like really lived amongst us. Would we blame them for reacting in such a violent, murderous way, right, to get away from that bondage? I'll leave that up to you, right? Do we blame the slave for killing his or her master, and do we look at it similarly here? And I do think that there is a link made here, because whenever we read a book about something that is not real, we do recognize that we are reading about ourselves, right? Always important to remember, right? So I think the link is made here. Who are the androids for us in the sense of history? The slaves of former human epics. Everybody who falls into that horrible category, and I think that includes the Jews in the Holocaust, who were put in concentration camps, used as slave labor until they were disposed of, right? Probably incredibly horrific. And heartless and callous and lacking the empathy that we are talking about here so far in the book. At the end of the book, Rick mentions an electric ostrich, right? And obviously the electric would be android, and ostrich is an animal that can go without water or fertility for a long time. And notice that Philip K. Dick, every single animal, every name has meaning for us. Here he's giving us an animal. What Rick would find this helpful. It would be a good animal to have, meaning these characteristics of being able to go without fertility. Look at that, he's able to survive in a relationship with Iran the way he has, where it's completely distant and cold, right? And yet he's able to survive in this world persistently, right, day after day. So I think it speaks to the type of existence he has here, right? Surviving on very little. And maybe everybody is here on Earth, surviving on very little. So last, I just want to say the Voigt-Kampff empathy test is designed to guard a fixed humanity from empathy for all other groups. Our pain and suffering is the only one that matters, not yours, which makes it easy for us to treat you in the way that we do, right? instead of extending that empathy to that group and having concern for them. And obviously that would probably affect the way you treat them, right? Here we go. This lecture may be broken into maybe 2 different parts. We'll see how it goes. Here we are, chapter 4. Of course, the intention is to get through all 10 chapters. Chapter 4, the plot. Rick has to go speak with the Rosen Association. Here, the Nexus 6 androids that need to be retired. So we're going to go find out more about these androids, almost like he's just gathering information. Right? We do find out that human beings with schizophrenic traits cannot pass the test. So if you were giving this test, the whole idea is to try to be able to differentiate between android and human. But if it was a schizophrenic human who suffered from episodes of schizophrenia, then you might not be able to tell the difference, and you would end up killing a human being, which would be a major error, right, within this industry, right, within this job. And here we are introduced to Rachel Rosen. And if you look up the meaning of Rachel, it takes you to the Hebrew, right? Hebrew, now with the name Rosen, right, which is interesting. Remember, it was a Hebrew name with Isidore, which had positive meaning as well, taking us back to Isis, one of the gods from Egyptian culture, right? Egyptian times. And Rachel is female sheep, all right? And I'll talk more about the whole kind of biblical idea of the sheep here in a little bit, but for those of you who have some religious background, you know the sheep is given pretty positive symbolism right off the bat. While at the Rosen Association, he notices all of the rare animals. There's another raccoon. We had another raccoon by the name of Bill, and I think raccoons will definitely pass as, just like cats, predators, right? So maybe linking those names. And there's an owl, predator as well. Allusion to the constant loss of a species speaks to the real issue currently of endangered species as well, right? Which is definitely, I think, unfortunately, every number of years goes by, and then there's another animal that just never comes back, right, on our globe here. Why despise an electric animal? Why have such a hard time with it? Rick says it's the tyranny of an object, he thought. It doesn't know I exist. So it seems a bit selfish, I guess, but why do I love my cat over here? I don't know what she's doing. She looks like she's tracking something. Who knows? She's not used to being outside, so. But why do I love her so much? Because I know she knows I exist, right? It's not a computer program inside that little kitty right there. It's a real breathing organism that I give time and attention to. I wish it could always be more, right? I have 2 kids as well, so it's always so busy. But I don't have to worry about some kind of lifeless void inside of that cat just going through some computer program or algorithm and giving me what I need without it being authentic, right? It's really there. Isn't that why we love our animals so much, right? Because they are real and they give real affection, right? So there is a paradox from Rick's perspective with the androids. They're kind of perfect in every way, but they're not human, so you don't feel good about the kind of reciprocation that's there, right? The whole goal, it seems, for Rick and the police organizations and the bigger organizations that are tied to that as well. If these Nexus 6s are too real, if they are now made so well that they are undetectable, that they can't tell the difference between human and android, then the objective is to stop the development of them. We've gone too far, right? It's mentioned that the Rosen Association has significant ties to Sydney's, the book that values all these real animals, which is about maintenance of real animals, right, however capitalized. Androids carry colonization efforts on their back, we learn, through that forced labor, treated like slaves. The whole colonization effort is basically possible because of that, just like the Egyptian Empire was, I guess, in some ways, as well as Rome. Right? What would they be without slave labor? The huge amounts of slave labor that they used. The 2 industries now seem linked, right? Androids and space colonization. The Voigt-Kampff empathy test measures capillary dilation, a shame or blushing reaction to something that is morally shocking, right? Notice that kind of ties back to Iran and her desire to have a absence of effect or a flattened effect, right? You don't react to morally shocking things any longer, like a normal person would, right? All right, chapter 5, Rick is the wasp. All right, that's kind of how we start off here. There's a question in the Voigt-Kampff empathy test about a wasp that kind of lands on your arm, and what, you know, we maybe, if you're lucky enough never to have an experience with a wasp, that's wonderful. But if you have, they're nuisances, they're a little dangerous, you're frightened, you have to run away, you have to have a little bit of fear. Like some of us get super nervous. I don't know if you can be allergic to wasp bites, I'm sure you can. Some of us have every reason to be a little nervous. So Rick is the wasp in the sense that he is chasing these androids, right? Starting off with Rachel, he's just kind of testing things out, learning more about the company itself and kind of the work they're doing. But when you think about his role as a bounty hunter, to essentially just fly around and kind of chase things, right? And to be a little bit of a nuisance. Here we go. Symbolically, he is giving her a test that denies her empathic ability. And then, and thus, once she fails, she is cut off from Rick and his society's own empathy. It's a strange double kind of cancellation of empathy, and you can think of the Nazis as one example, right? You can note the diction, a little bit of diction here when he is administering the test. It says he hunts for his next question. He is given these predatorial characteristics here as he is giving this test, right? The test feels more predatorial than a test probably should through the diction. I noticed now that I was taking more time, preparing these notes, some questions about pregnancy. We already talked about barren wombs, so this kind of idea of birth, conception, right? Barrenness. So questions about pregnancy here. Obviously, we get a little bit of exposition here. Abortions are made illegal in this world, right? That needs to repopulate desperately, right? So obviously, abortions aren't even a question. And there's also a question about a butterfly jar, which I think thematically will speak to the idea of rejuvenation, right? And to speak to the story at large, all of these androids, let's not forget, the ones we come into contact with, and some we spend more time with than others that he is hunting, all of them mutinied and have real blood on their hands. They killed their captors. So in a way, they are all in need of some kind of redemption and rejuvenation, right? And maybe we can just think of rejuvenation in other ways as well. But I think all the questions really do help to suggest some of the bigger topics that are a part of the characters' interactions. There's a question about a bullfight. And notice with a bullfight, what do? You put an animal out of its misery, right? So think about that, the whole idea of putting an animal or someone out of its misery. All these questions have something to do with things that are happening in the story. She does pass the test, which at least in some way does mean something, right? Rick doesn't like the idea of being stalked, doesn't like being nagged by the wasp, right? He starts to think about this idea of being, actually hunted by the androids, right? Them coming to him. And he doesn't like that idea. But it's so hypocritical of him to feel that way because he's the one who's going out and killing these guys in the first place, and these girls, right? These androids. So it's a very hypocritical thought to be worried about being hunted here. Rachel's origins are shared at the very end of the text. She is an android, and she's a sales prototype, right? Which means she kind of helps to demonstrate the technology. But of course, the symbolism of the name meaning is going to be highly important as we move forward. Rachel is sheep, and we'll talk more about that later on. All right? Questions moving forward. Is Rachel capable as an android of empathy? Right? That whole idea is supposed to be that they are these solitary predators, not capable of putting themselves in someone else's shoes and making a decision based off that, right? Just worry about their own survival. Is she capable of empathy? That's a huge question for the book. Could she be the birth growth of a new possibility, just like a rose coming from the Rosen Association? Chapter 6, Buster Friendly, your TV personality. Reminds me of like a Jimmy Fallon or somebody like that, right? Or Jay Leno, if I think back to some older times here, right? And we find out through a lot of his interviews that he has and just what he's saying on the show, he is very distrustful of Mercer. So he's got a bone to pick, as the figure of speech goes, with Mercer. And here we get Pris. Ancient, primitive, venerable, that's what the name means, Pris, right? And put together with malice, right? Put together with malice. And maybe that speaks to like what we've done with androids, right? We've put them together but for hateful purposes, such as to be slaves and to treat them in such a horrible way. The building they live in was abandoned and being Kippleized. And John has been affected by radiation so much so as to render him impaired in a few different ways. So in a way, he has a pass to stay within these irradiated areas, and he can like live in these old places that are actually pretty amazing. The movie's got that got that detail right. The first Blade Runner, when they introduce you to his living situation, he's got this huge apartment, but there's no one there, right? He's completely by himself. John feels defeated by the Kipple, which feels a little bit kind of nihilistic, like totally giving up. And I guess it follows, he says it was similar to Gresham's law about bad money. And so I looked that up, and, bad money is just basically when it starts to kind of get corrupted and only support a few different people, right? Instead of like helping everybody out. And that's what bad money is considered. You can make of that what you need to. John stands against the Kipple, at least while he is alive, kind of, makes a stand against it, opposes it. He says Mercer is the only thing that defies a final state of Kippleization. Remember, Andes cannot fuse with Mercer. They have so tried. So Pris may seem a bit apprehensive toward John's enthusiasm about and dedication toward Mercer, right? Because she's tried it. She's been excluded as an android. And so she probably has some resentment there. John feels a coldness, kind of like a spider, perhaps. Pris claims to be Rachel at the end, which is kind of strange. And she shames him for being a chicken head. And the term chicken head means a special. But it's more insulting, meaning you have impaired abilities and I'm calling you out on it, right? Making you feel ashamed about it. So that's not a great thing to do to somebody, like, first impressions, right? To make him feel inferior. The actual name Pris Stratton, Stratton means Old Roman Road, which maybe takes us back to like the Roman Empire. And when you think about the persecution of Christ, it was the Roman Empire, right? So that might be one to consider. Or she could be considered a Rodin for Batty, Roy Batty, and we'll get to his character later on. Chapter 7. John falls back on old pre-war traditions, thinking a woman likes to cook. So even those themes are explored here a little bit. Old world notions, or the 1950s, for instance, just these old notions that existed before World War Terminus of what a woman's role was in our society. Remember we talked earlier about cod pieces and the accentuation of male genitalia. Maybe that speaks to an environment where women are definitely more domesticated and fulfilling roles outside of public than men. He ascends to get to his apartment, just to point that out. We're always looking at that theme of up and down here. I'll repeat it just because it's here, a bit more on the god Isis, caring god, loved all, even her jealous brother, as I mentioned. The androids are very jealous of John because he's a human being, and he's not hunted, he's not having his lifespan cut short. So they are jealous of John, I think. So that one speaks. It's very specific. But we'll see if he still finds that he loves them, right, and kind of helps them. Also, it's the God who kind of protected children, healed the sick. We'll see if John has the ability to heal anybody or anything in this story, so something to keep in mind. And the goddess of life and magic, and I think that one is very accurate when you get to some of the events that take place much later on in the text. Things that are bringing life back and are happening in magical ways, right? All of this is important as we go into the scene with the dead cat and this theoretical revival that takes place in this chapter. John works for an electric animal service that passes itself off as a real animal vet service, right? We talked about that. The question is, is it a deception, or is it just kind of a hope, a mindset of some kind that this life must be tended to as well? Electric animals' life is just as vital as real life, and we must send out aid and assistance and help them out, right? They need help. They're in a desperate state of need. We're not going to say these electric animals don't need care just because they're electric. We're still going to send out a team to help them out, right? And that's the service that they provide. One of the companies that they use when working on animals, fixing animals, is wheelwright and carpenter. My take, wheel is the idea of time moving forward, even into a world that requires the use of androids, right? Inevitably, in carpenter is going to be a reference to Christ and rebirth, right? Knowing that his father, Joe, was a carpenter, right? Joseph. John feels his ability, so he's kind of associated with, that field. John feels his abilities fading, linked to a fading earth. On the TV, Buster Friendly and Amanda Werner. And this is interesting. Amanda translates to deserving to be loved. That's what the name means. Beautiful name. I got a sister named Amanda. And Werner, it translates to the defending warrior, right? And this makes sense because she is by Buster's side and says that she will protect Buster from rocks, as they're kind of making a reference to Mercer and the ascent up the hill getting hit by rocks. So in a way, she says her name implies or suggests exactly what she's willing to do, which is protect and defend Buster. We go all the way down to get to Sloat's shop, so it's a major descent to a man shrouded in dust, right? John says Mercer always rises up from the tomb world. This is important because we are now literally in the tomb world in this chapter, right? Sloat, the drain at the bottom. John could not tell the difference between real and artificial. Perhaps it's in his nature not to. Maybe he doesn't care. Maybe that's kind of one of the lessons learned from John's character, is that for him it doesn't matter, and it speaks to a new mentality, a new empathy moving forward in the world, possibly. Sloat wants John to call owner. He is upset about the dead real cat. John says, quote unquote, all life returns. Definitely this idea that it's kind of supported by some of the ideas of Christ and resurrection. Validated by Milt's face being described as the color of dog manure. Manure being fertilizer and rebirth, right? And things used to bring things back. The cat's name is Horus. Horus translates to timekeeper. The notion of time is, I think, important as we kind of transition into new eras. Ed translates to prosperous defender. And everything seems to be a reflection on Rick as a defender, especially with the tests he gives and the bounty hunting that he does. All right, some other names. Pilsen. That's the last name of the couple who's lost the real cat. Pilsen. Pilsen is just providing the allusions here. It's a city in Bohemia, right? And I don't know too much about this, but I think Bohemia is a kind of city and culture of old, ancient, but it actually kind of opposes, I think, some of the ideas of Christ, in the sense that it's not really a minimal and giving society, but rather a kind of rich and luxurious and, a society that doesn't represent that kind of minimalist living, right? But I don't know too much about that. But I know Bohemia is not necessarily a great place when you read biblical kind of scriptures. The cat can be replaced, brought back to life in 10 days to ensure a replica of the very real thing. And that's a minimal time when you consider suffering compared to eternity, right? All right. Here we have Isis and Horus. He who is above, and this is kind of, we talked about Horus a moment ago as timekeeper, but this is now going deeper into the Egyptian symbolism. So here we have Isis and Horus. He who is above, he who is distant, basically the sun and the moon and the heavens which have disappeared from earth. The death of Horus is an analogy to the death of the planet or death of heavenly connection. Horus is also symbolic of regality and royalty, right? So just to tie us to some of those bigger kinds of, you know, the spectrums of ascent in heaven and some of these ideas of eternity and cycles. Okay, chapter 8, moving along here. We have another descent to Bryant's, right, where he has to start to get some of the first information about the bounty hunting. His first target is Polokov. Posing as a special, he was able to escape Dave's detection and almost killed him, I believe. He's going to get help from a Soviet cop named Sander Kadalyi, or Kadalyi. Sander, here we go. It translates to defender and protector of man, right? So even the people he is linking up with, everyone is on this level of protection. Our first reference to Luba Luft comes through, Luba Luft, the next target on his list. Reference to onion skin carbons. And I think that's very deliberate in the sense that things aren't what they seem. You got to peel back the layers of the onion to get to the real situation, right? The real truth. And I think that's what that's a reference to. All right. There's a bunch of that in this book. He pats his laser tube, right, as he's getting ready to go out on this mission. What does that tell us about Rick and his weapon? Moving forward with the plot, he looks for Polokov at the city dump. Then he jumps over to his apartment. Rick has some of the most powerful gadgets you could ever have that makes it pretty easy to find and hunt down these androids. He's got something called a Penfield wave transmitter. Again, the same company, Penfield. A Penfield wave transmitter that essentially just kind of like shuts down androids and just like makes them freeze, which must make it definitely give you a huge heads up, right? Later on, just a few paragraphs later, we find out he has an infinity key that opens every lock in the city. I mean, talk about power, right? Talk about ability. Not good to be an android, right, here on Earth. When you start to look at Luba Luft, Luba means lover, right, which is an interesting word to think about in contrast to the lack of love, right, that we have throughout the text. And Luft is so helpful for us. Luft is German for air and kind of fly, right? And here you have decorators putting a roof on things that are trying to ascend. So even the name kind of foreshadows that, you know, what Rick's role will be as they start to interact. This is probably, honestly, I think some of the more interesting chapters of the book because Luba Luft is such a interesting character herself, right? She's an opera singer, which for an android doesn't even seem possible. Does that make sense for an Andy? Can an Andy do that job effectively? Doesn't it take a human to make or create art or not? That's another one of the books I teach, Rise of the Robots, speaks to that. Will there be a time when AI can produce art and human expression on a level that is passable for most of us, right? That we accept it. And can she do this job? I mean, to be a successful opera singer is not an easy thing to do. So how is an Andy pulling this off? It already kind of makes us a little curious here. As he sets up for a test that seeks to nullify a sense of empathy, she engages in a job that seems to require empathy on a few levels. To be an opera singer, never been one, but I could imagine, not only do you have to have an expressive voice and be able to kind of get people to feel emotionally just through your voice, when you really prepare for these things, you're learning about characters, you're reading, it's empathy to connect to characters that you read about in literature, so it's really empathy on a few different levels, right? All right, notice that Rachel is the sheep, translates to female sheep, perfect, calls and offers assistance. That doesn't sound like an android being a solitary predator. That sounds like an android that maybe, unless it's just all show, maybe it's more to deceive him at this point, but that sounds like an android capable of empathy. She's worried about him. She wants to give him assistance because she's worried about the situation he's in. Is this because she's having a moral response to Rick? This consideration directly following this irony of Luft as an opera singer, meaning the empathy that androids are capable of. We're seeing it now in a couple different ways. He mentions, am I always going to have to worry about, and then he says, quote unquote, Rachel Rosen popping up through the dust, a rose popping out of the radioactive dust of the earth, right? Empathy coming back for the first time. World War Terminus, complete lack of empathy. Maybe it's coming back here a little bit in this character. Rick reads up on her. He looks at her poop sheet. The predator tracking its prey, right, following the poop around. Is he the solitary predator? He just felt disgruntled over the idea of a sheep helping him. He meets up with Sandra. Rick knows his guns. This is character building. He's a gun guy, right? Obviously trained. He's in the business. Rick confuses the man's identity, almost like it doesn't matter. It's kind of strange. Rick, I'm just going through the plot here. Rick shoots and retires Polokov, calms himself after killing him, and he's satisfied with the $1,000 bounty that he's going to receive. He calls Iran. She's in a self-accusatory depression, perhaps repenting for Rick's actions, right, and the work he's doing. He says nothing penetrates. Penetrates an interesting word here, which can be a thematic word in regards to birth, rejuvenation. Also, later on, we'll see what happens with some other characters with Rick. There's an irony of escaped androids wanting to live more than humans. The example being Iran, who's like kind of ready to surrender and give up. But it's androids who are really running for their lives and trying to escape detection because they want to live, right? And look at the lives they're living. Look at Luba Luft here. Luft sings appropriately at the War Memorial Opera House. Very ironic. We can cure war and conflict, such as War Terminus, with more empathy, art, etc. Or this reflection on war needs empathy, and Luba can deliver. The lamb occurs 28 times in Scripture. That's her age, 28. This occurs 28 times in Scripture, a reference to Christ as the lamb that takes away the sins of the world. War is a great example of a sin that needs to be repented for. Chapter ends in irony. Rick is enthused. He is in hungry, gleeful anticipation, hungry like the predator, and gleeful, he's happy. I don't think this is a good moment to feel good about Rick based on the way that he's feeling here in the text. All right, almost at the end here. Chapter 9. We start with the presentation. They're putting on a performance of Mozart's Magic Flute. And I don't want to get into the backstory too much on this, but it is designed in a way that suggests meaning for our story here, right? It does have relevance. The German translation, there's a little bit of German that's shared here. It's with magic bells, a man can dwindle his enemies with slackness. So with sound and music, a man or a woman can make his enemies kind of give up and just kind of fall down, right? But notice it's not through violence. It's not through a kind of directed combat or something like that. It's through sound, right? Rick reflects. These are very important chapters. You know, I almost like to think of these as climatic in some way, because I do think the seed is planted for who Rick is in the role he's playing here. He sees himself as as involved in this, quote-unquote, form-destroying process of entropy, right? The Rosen Association creates and I unmake. And this is an awareness that is growing for him. He is more a part of the problem than he is a part of the solution, all right? Pamina mentions in the play, or in the musical, in the opera, he mentions something about the truth, and I think Rick has realized his role as destroyer is truth, especially after seeing the humanity involved in their creation. All right, and Luba Luft is just starting to show us what she's made of. He thinks the better she functions, the better a singer she is, the more I am needed. In order, I have to retire her. Why? Androids are threatening humanity, our own fragile, kind of questionable humanity that we have. He is the guard, the defender, the protector against Luba, who is the idea of love and lover, right? She claims he's an android. She actually makes him fall back on his heels and say, are you sure you're not an android? Look at the way you're hunting me. Look at who you are. And he actually has to think about it. He does seem to fit the descriptor of not caring much about androids. That may change. This comment stops him in his tracks, makes him question if he is one. And that's why I think there's a bit of that kind of climatic feel here where it's going to cause some major kind of change here in our character that he's going to have to pursue. He has to give her the Voigt-Kampff test, and he plays the role of wasp once again. She asks, what is a wasp? And he says, a stinging bug that flies, right? A stinging bug is aggression, murder, carnage. With a bug that flies, that's interesting. Possibility of ascent and salvation, right? That sinners can gain a salvation. That a wasp will sting, it will harm, but at the same time it can still ascend, right? And it can still find some kind of meaning and forgiveness. Once Shio knows what he's talking about, and let me say this too, not only is this really an important idea for Rick, but really all the Andes that mutinied, you can sin, but you can still ascend. So that really speaks to a kind of biblical spiritual level. All right, people, picking it right back up where I left off here in chapter 9. And what a chapter it is, because I think it really helps to shed light on probably, the biggest theme we have going here, going back to just kind of how we treat other people and empathy and some of these giant themes of the novel. And he's giving her the test, and she always has to kind of stop him to get some clarification, to have some words kind of explained to her. And she doesn't know what a wasp is in English, but as soon as he can kind of put it in German, Wespe, then it makes sense to her. And again, I think the reason for the German providing the clarity here for her is because it's bringing us back to that German context of the Holocaust, right? Now that we're kind of in the language of that experience, now it makes sense to her, right? What a wasp is. I had mentioned, I'll say it one more time because I think it's an interesting way of looking at the whole idea of a wasp, a stinging bug that flies, stinging, of course, aggression, almost this kind of annoyance, this nagging, right? Following these androids around and having to kind of bring them to justice, so to speak, and their lives. But at the same time, it flies, which means it can ascend, which can take on, at least a few different meanings for us by the end of the text. But one might be this idea of salvation if we look at it from a religious context. And boy, are we starting to get into a religious context here as we get into end of chapter 9 and really chapter 10. And we'll get there in just a moment. A couple other things are she mentions. Somehow the reference of the Bataan Death March in the Philippines comes up, which is a quick allusion to another genocide, another act of genocide in the world with the Philippines, which is actually a U.S. ally, which is probably why we don't hear about it all too much, right? Because we are allies with the Philippines. But that's another quick reference to a genocide. The even bigger example, of course, being the Holocaust. That one always kind of referenced here throughout. It speaks to the unbelievable, horrific, and horrible treatment that one group of people can incur on another, right? I think that's really what it speaks to. The next question, a word is used here, verdant, which is synonymous to fertile. This is leading us into another big theme, which is the potential conception of a child. What does it mean for a woman? And being able to conceive a child is this kind of rite of passage for many, many, many women. But can it exist for android women, right? And this text will start to do that exploration. We do know that as an android, she cannot reproduce. So any of these, whether it be Luba Luft, whether it be Rachel Rosen or others, they are not given the capability to reproduce. One thing, and you can kind of be your own judge here, that she really criticizes the Voigt-Kampff empathy test, and I think it's very suitable. We need to criticize this test, knowing that the whole design of it is to keep one group of people from feeling empathy toward another, right? And kind of finding a way to exclude them. In this case, of course, it's androids. In the larger sense, it could be all kinds of people who are targeted in these horrific situations, right? These holocausts, these genocides. So I think she does a very laudable job of criticizing the test. And one thing she says is, there's a lot of questions about sex and kind of the intrusion of sex. And we have seen that word penetration once before when it came to John. So kind of the intrusive male role when we talk about sex. And a lot of those questions have to do with women getting pregnant. What would women do with, there's the abortion kind of question, right? So a lot of those questions are starting just to make us think about that particular topic. All right, so as we inch up into chapter 10, where it's very strange. Finally, after reading through the text a number of times, this doesn't strike me as like the most odd thing. I think especially now because I just see there's a lot of biblical symbolism here, and it speaks to a kind of religious rejuvenation, I think, right? Kind of a spiritual rejuvenation in the character. So, one of the first, we get a lot of numbers here, right? As far as kind of the charges that Rick has against him, right? All the different charges, what he's being charged with. So the first one is 842, and what I ended up doing here, and I think especially going into chapter 10, I think some of these are useful, and I think this occurs sometimes with certain authors, but it's really giving us Bible passages, right? Whether it be Old Testament, New Testament, and we can look these things up online. I mean, that really is the beauty of Google and kind of online searching these days, is we can really reference this information really quickly, right? And we can see if it actually makes sense, if it's kind of helpful, if it's somewhat accurate. So 842, one thing I found was John 842, so it's kind of, they do their passages with the different names. John 842, and it's basically interprets as Jesus saying he has not come on his own, but that he has been sent by God. So this idea that been sent by a power greater than himself, right, at that time, right? John 8:42. And remember, John is all about the prophecy of Christ, right? Which I think if we're seeing it right now, and it's an accurate allusion, it might speak to a certain foreshadowing of those kinds of characteristics, right? Kind of coming later in the text. With this, we go to a new police station, and this is where I think it's pretty accurate reading into it on this religious level, because notice the police station, he's never been here before. It's kind of a mystery. It's on mission. And we know what a mission is. In fact, we live in California. I think it's San Juan Capistrano has a beautiful mission there, right? But remember what a mission stands for. It is to, and there's a lot of criticism against them when you talk about real history, I think, but it converts people to Christianity. It's a place where you can change your life and kind of find a new belief system, right? And I think that's what's happening here. Rick has arrived. It's after that interesting reflection he's had with Luba Luft and that whole idea of form destroyer and form creator, and he sees which side he falls on. And I think that's why, sequentially this makes sense, that we would arrive at the mission at this point, because he's already thought about this. Where was the old police station, you might be asking? Lombard Street. The translation on that is going to be, it's a reference to a Germanic tribe that overruns Italy. So a very aggressive Germanic tribe that took over a part of Italy and kind of settled there, right? Which I think is like Lombardy. I think they might put a Y on it, but Lombard Street. So you see the stark contrast that we have here. The new one is on mission, the old one is on Lombard. And you can even see like an old Germanic tribe, it's really speaking to the kind of warrior people that came from that particular territory, contrasting it with this whole idea of a Catholic rejuvenation, or a Christian Catholic rejuvenation, right? A mission, and converting people to a new kind of way of life. All right. The new one on mission is old and run down, just like kind of maybe the morals and empathy of our society here. And Lombard Street, as we know, is the base of bounty hunting, right? That's where he goes to find out who his targets are and learn more about these people, right? So a stark contrast there, and I think that's very helpful here in the middle of the book, because we see a side that he used to represent, which in my feeling is going to be that Germanic tribe, right? Lombard Street. And now things are going to start changing as he goes through some heavy considerations here. Chapter 10, last one. We're at the police station. First impression, he likes this department, right? He's led to a small white table, and the color symbolism is super important and super helpful, because this will occur one more time where we have this clear whiteness in front of us. So here it's a small white table. It might be something else at the very end of the text. No spoilers. But it's going to tie us back to what's happening here with this religious kind of revival for him, right? And what does white normally stand for in literature? Purity, innocence, right? Blank slate, starting over again, right? There's a few ways of looking at it. He's being booked, which may be a religious judgment of some kind, laying out his sins, right? We start to get some of his the way, you know, the charges and like the numbers they use for the charges. And one is 612. And this, if I started looking it up, was Matthew 6:12, forgive us our debts and we forgive our debtors. Forgive our sins and we'll forgive the people who have sinned against us. Forgive us for our own sins and we will do the same for those who have kind of done it against us. A complete nullifying, right, of all these sins, all these debts that we carry. This is the moment for this, perhaps, for Rick as a bounty hunter. Another one is 304, which maybe is Proverbs 34, 30:4, God in power to ascend and descend. This kind of power that God has to ascend and descend along with Christ, right? Being half man, half God, right? And there, I think that's a helpful one because maybe we're at the bottom. Maybe Rick's journey so far, maybe John has something, you know, he's going through his own journey, but has been to go down, down, down. Maybe it's time to start following a different direction here. So in that Proverbs 34, the whole idea of ascending and descending is very, you know, it speaks to that major theme in this text. So the whole idea of forgiving our debts, being forgiven for our debts and we forgive our debtors, right? This does nicely apply to Rick. He can be forgiven for his sins, and it can relieve him of his duty to destroy through forgiveness of others who have sinned, right? He can basically give up the job. Those androids mutinied and they killed their human captors, but maybe the whole idea here is he can say, I forgive them for what they've done. I do not need to bring them to justice. I do not need to punish them. I don't need to retire them, kill them, however you see it. As he comes into this station on mission, he's described as a peace officer. That's an interesting way of describing Rick, who actually is a bounty hunter and the opposite of peace. But here in this moment, we get the word peace. And lastly, there we get the number 406. And this could be Isaiah 40:6. People's faithfulness is like grass kept to this world, being as weak and vulnerable as a spindle of grass where you can't do much to regenerate. So, you know, the idea that people on earth, their faith is like grass and that it kind of dwindles and falls away. So nothing can be done to renew their hearts and cleanse their nature. This is actually a quite a despondent passage, Isaiah 46, right? Because it's actually one of the ones that I've read quite a few of these as you make references to literature, and this one just seems rather like depressing, as in, yeah, that's what happens. People's faith dwindles because it is of this kind of earthly realm. It is not made of the strongest stuff, right? And maybe that speaks to what Rick is feeling right now. And I think it has a lot to do with Luba Luft, right? And his beginnings with her as he starts to think about who she is and what she represents versus himself. Okay. There is divine power and regeneration for God to help and assist. Flowers, right? Men's honor, riches, achievements will fade as well. And here we have Officer Cram, who has brought him into this station. And the only thing that's really mentioned, well, if you look up the name Cram, it means old and ill. And that is definitely a good, accurate, and fond representation of what it means to be from Earth, because eventually we all get old and hopefully you don't get ill, but that's a very common thing as well. It speaks to living a life on this Earth and maybe there's something after, right? But Cram is a good representation of, and maybe even the Earth itself, old and ill, irradiated, right? Because of the nuclear fallout. And so Cram he's the perfect person to bring Rick, who also struggles in some regards, to this place of rejuvenation, right? Delivering him. All right. Officer Cram says these charges, all these ones we've mentioned, as if it's very routine stuff, in the sense people are sinners in need of direction, and he has delivered Rick, right? He knows. Now we have these two parallel agencies, which I think equals out to two different sides to Deckard, and what we can say about his humanity, right? The predator, the warrior, or somebody who has had a new way now of seeing life and creation, right? And we'll see if this sticks. We'll see how his journey goes. The police head at this agency on mission is Garland. You translate Garland, it is from the Spearland, war. So that's an interesting one. Not what I would have expected, right? But you think about the garland and the stuff they wear on their hair after being victorious in combat and war, right? And the celebration of it. Here he is. Also, there is this possible choice between George Gleason and Phil Resch. Never really stopped to look at this until now. Garland says you can either be with Phil Resch or you can be with George Gleason. We know we get Phil Resch, and he is quite the interesting character. He serves as a nice contrast, right, to, and we can see what the similarities are with Rick. Yeah, both bounty hunters. That's a great way to start, right? And we can start to talk about who these people are. The other one is George Gleason. Very different. Check this out. George translates to farmer. We had that with of Mice and Men, right? We got our famous George there. Very apt. Farmer. Gleason is inexperienced. Gleason is inexperienced. Phil translates to lover of horses, right? And this being on horseback. Notice the difference. You could even say like, war, right? So George is farmer, somebody who's more passive, right, in terms of life, whereas Phil is probably more aggressive, right, on horseback. Gleason was inexperienced. Resch, strong and quick, which almost sounds like experience, right, when you compare it to the idea of being inexperienced. So I think George Gleason would have been a more peaceful choice. To put it, shortly, would have been a more peaceful choice for Rick, but he ends up with Phil Resch, right? On a moral scale, he sniffs out, hunts Luba, and then arrives ready to kill Garland, all right? The wrath makes me feel like this is our God figure, this police chief Garland. Part of me feels like this is maybe the strongest representation that we have of a God figure in terms of power and knowledge and judgment. And he's given the word wrath, right? His wrath came out. And that is commonly a word that we associate with a powerful God, right? The wrath of God. He has arranged for Rick to have to join with the worst possible version of himself, and that's going to be Phil Resch, right? And, Phil's going to be along for the ride here for a little bit, right, as some of us may already know. The chapter ends with a reference to the Bonelli reflex arc test. And this is the test that this particular police agency is giving people, as opposed to Rick and his agency, which gives the Voigt-Kampff test. In fact, they don't know much about the Voigt-Kampff test, just like Rick doesn't know much about the Bonelli test, as he's now stuck in this kind of police station on the side of town he didn't even know kind of existed, right? Let's look at the word Bonelli. Obviously, probably, Italian. Good, right? It means good. So in a way, they're used to giving people the good test. And that might just be, a stark reference to like morals and ethics, to judge if you are a good person. I always say that to some of my students in high school, which is, if we get into these themes, I say, notice you're never judged on like if you're a good person necessarily. It's always on skills and how adept you are at this or that, but it's never on like how good, because it's so subjective. It's hard to really measure that. But at the same time, we don't even really take it into consideration, right? Well, maybe that's what this test is all about, at least if we translate the language. It's a good test, right? Just to see if you are a good person, or a good anything for that matter, now that we're talking about androids here. To see if somebody has a good heart.
Garland says that he doesn't apply testing because it would lower staff morale. And I think he means because they would find out that they're not good people, right? You don't want to let Phil Resch take the Benelli test, which tests for are you a good person, because what we're going to learn about Phil without saying too much is he isn't what we might classify as a good person, right? A good person. Well, how will the testing go? He's going to test all these people. That's the end of, pretty much the first half. I think it's a good place to end, and I'll see you for the second half. I hope these lectures are helpful, and I'm really happy to finally be able to kind of share some of this analysis, because I've worked on this for at least a few years now and taught this for a while. So thank you. I hope you're having a good day.